Greetings. My name is Dan Van Abs, and this presentation was developed for the New York State Turf and Landscape Association. It's called If You Do It to the Land, You Do It to the Water, and the focus here is on making sure that people realize just how much influence the use of our land has on both the supply and quality of our water. As a brief background on me, I've been involved in the water resources management field for about 40 years now, starting with the nonprofit sector in northern New Jersey, working with the state of New Jersey for about 26 years, and recently, for the last 11 years or so, being with Rutgers University as a faculty member. I've done some interesting projects in the state of New York, especially in Rockland and Orange counties, but also with regard to statewide water supply conservation and efficiency policies. So we're going to be dealing with the issue of your community's future vision with regard to sustainable water systems. Where do you want to be in 30 years? How does water play a part in that vision? And if you put it all together, is it truly sustainable? Is it something that can work forever? Because we need our water infrastructure, we need our water supply, we need our water quality to be capable of existing for centuries into the future, not just for the next few years. And that needs to be done within the community and also within the region. So context matters, and one of the things that we can do in water resources management is use scenarios as a way of understanding whether or not we can achieve our vision and whether our vision is sustainable. So the first question, of course, is what is a watershed? And basically it's the land area that flows to a single surface water output. In Westchester County, we're dealing with the Hudson River estuary, so the Peekskill and Haverstraw Bay area, and so on along the west side. Then you have on the far east side the Long Island Sound watersheds, so these are the streams and rivers that run to the Sound directly. And then you have the Croton and Bronx River watersheds, which are especially important in Westchester County because of their historic relationship with New York City. One equation, it will be the only equation in this entire presentation, is this one. P equals E plus T plus R plus I. So precipitation is the P. If it doesn't come down from the sky, it's not a water resource that we can deal with. Then that is moves into the other four parts, which is evaporation, the water that moves from the land surface back up directly into the sky, transpiration, which is the water that moves through plants and then back up into the atmosphere, runoff, which is the water that moves directly across the land surface into a surface water, and infiltration, which is the water that moves down through the land into the subsurface, into what's called groundwater. That's the natural water cycle. People then take from that water cycle. We withdraw water for our own purposes, whether it's potable use in the homes, industrial use, agriculture, lawn irrigation, pools, and so on. And then that water eventually goes back into the system through either wastewater treatment plants, evaporation and transpiration, and so on. And then you have the issue of climate change. We know that the climate is changing. We have been measuring it now for decades, seeing the changes from climate change. And as Yogi Berra is quoted as saying, the future ain't what it used to be. So we're going to have to deal with that issue. A little bit about the New York City water supply system. Back in 1842, when New York City implemented the Croton Aqueduct and started its first major supplies from outside of the city, it was from Westchester County. As part of that whole process of developing the Croton system, the agreement was that New York City would also supply water to Westchester County, and part of that is from within the county at these reservoirs that you see here. So about 85% of Westchester County residents get their water from the New York City system as part of this deal. And that means that pollutants going into surface waters in the Croton watershed can damage water quality in those reservoirs and part of the Westchester water supply. So let's take a first look at what we're seeing with regard to climate change. One of the interesting things is that we are seeing more and more of our rain coming in heavier events. Across the northeastern part of the country, it's almost twice as common as it used to be. Total rainfall is not changing all that significantly in this area, but it's coming down in big storms, 2, 3, 4, 5 inches of rain all at once. On the flip side, the expectation is that droughts are going to become more frequent, at least for the smaller droughts, maybe the less severe droughts. But we're not sure whether the worst droughts we're going to see in the future are any worse than the ones that we have seen in the past, for instance, 1960s drought. With regard to temperatures, it's going up. It's going up in the daytime, it's going up in the nighttime, it's going up faster during the winter months, which we're seeing now in terms of more of our precipitation in rainfall than in snowfall. And all of this means that we're extending the growing season, and that means that we're increasing evaporation and we're increasing transpiration from plants, which has an effect on water supply. The other thing that we're seeing, and again, this has been documented very, very well, is increasing sea level. So the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation is projecting nearly 3 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100, and that's at a medium projection in terms of climate change. It's not the worst case scenario. It's also not the best case scenario. So if the world gets its act in gear and really clamps down on greenhouse gases, we could see less sea level rise. But a 3-foot sea level rise along the coast is a big issue for these coastal communities. When we think about runoff, the R in our equation, stronger storms mean that more of that stormwater is going to run off into our streams, and that is going to create larger peak flows in our smaller streams and rivers. You can see here a graph of the Bronx River at the Botanical Garden, and these large spikes that you see are rainfall events. And that brings us to infiltration, the final part of our equation. Infiltration is a little harder to understand because it's out of sight, but basically what it means is that water that is coming down is moving through the soil and then finally encounters an area where the soil is completely filled with water. All of the spaces between the soil particles or rocks or whatever it happens to be are filled with water. This is groundwater. And if there is enough groundwater of good enough quality that people can use it through wells, that's an aquifer. So all aquifers are groundwater, but not all groundwater is an aquifer. That water moves over time to stream systems. And then you discharge out to the stream or out to, for instance, the Long Island Sound or the Hudson Estuary, and then it becomes part of the saltwater system. As groundwater moves to streams, it supports the stream flow during the low flow periods, the periods that are in between the storms. So for instance, again at Bronx River, you can see these low periods that are depicted by the green lines. This is basically river flow supported by groundwater. And then you have the stream periods where you are seeing storm events. And then again, you have this base flow. So sometimes upstream flows to a gauging station are affected by reservoir releases or wastewater treatment plant releases and so on, may be affected here at Bronx River. But in general, this is what you're looking for in terms of what's called a stream hydrograph, is these low flows are most often groundwater flows. Development then changes everything. During a natural ground cover, you have relatively little runoff because the land surface is very uneven. It is a lot of vegetation, and so the water tends to stay where it falls. A big chunk goes back up into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration, but then the rest of it goes into the ground through infiltration. As we start developing low density, medium density, and then higher density, what you see is interesting. You see a great increase in runoff from 10% to maybe over 50% of the water as runoff. You see a significant decrease in infiltration, and you see a bit of a decrease in evapotranspiration. What does that mean? That means that more and more you're going to see peak flows in streams going up, and that means more and more flooding. And it means that the low flows in streams are going down because there's less and less groundwater to support those stream flows. So let's shift to water quality issues. What is it that pollutes our waterways? And one of the interesting things that people tend not to think about is sediment. Sediment nationally is the #1 pollutant of our streams. Sediment can come from erosion of stream banks, it can come from construction sites, it can come from erosion of stormwater channels, all sorts of different places. But it has some pretty severe effects on streams because it buries the bottom habitat. All sorts of critters that live in the bottom will then be suffocated. It can change stream structures. It can fill ponds and lakes and wetlands. So for freshwaters and also for estuaries, major impacts from sediment. And there's a local role that people can play, one of which is to reduce stream erosion. How many people mowed the lawn right down to the water's edge? It's almost like if you don't get your lawnmower wheels wet, you haven't done a good job. Instead of doing that, back up, reinstall natural vegetation, natural species along the water's edge, and reduce the erosion that occurs from that process. Another pollutant of great concern, and this one we see all over the place, solid and floatable materials, everything from plastic bottles to paper wastes from fast food places and plastic bags flying in the air and into our streams. And this has both aesthetic and ecological damages. So again, there's a local role. You can reduce and capture litter. Clean streets programs, cleaning up commercial areas, reducing the amount of plastic waste. New Jersey, for instance, has banned businesses using plastic bags in many situations. So we're seeing far fewer plastic bags in our streams and hung up in our trees. Next one, nutrients. So nutrients primarily are going to be things like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are very common in fertilizers. Lawn fertilizers in suburban areas are a big issue, and they can result in this kind of problem where you have far excessive plant growth within the waterway. And what happens is you get the supercharge of oxygen production during the daytime when photosynthesis is happening. And then at night, the oxygen level takes a dive, goes down to, it can go down to 0, at which point you're starting to kill animals. Where do these nutrients come from? In suburban areas, it's very largely from lawn fertilizers, especially the phosphorus, where you see these test results from 2012, Rutgers Soil Testing Lab. 56% of the soil tests showed very high phosphorus levels, and another 20% showed high phosphorus levels. So people are over applying fertilizers. And this has been true for basically the whole post-war, World War II period. Green lawns have become too much of an amenity value, and the result is water pollution. and eutrophication, this overgrowth of algae. I talked about how development results in a great increase in runoff. That runoff has effects on streams. What happens is the more runoff you have and the faster that stream moves, the more it is going to erode the stream bank and the stream bed. So the graphic on the right-hand side shows this process. First of all, you have a stable condition when everything's in balance. Then you get too much stormwater coming in and you get incision. The stream bank is cutting down. Well, the more you cut down, the more unstable the stream banks are on either side, and they fall into the stream. So you're having more and more erosion. Eventually, you get a process where you are stabilizing, and then you wind up with a new floodplain, a new stream channel that is deeper down and wider than the original stream channel. That stabilization process can take decades, and it only really stabilizes once development has stabilized and you're not getting additional levels of runoff. However, because our storms are getting to be stronger and stronger, even if there's no additional development in an area, we will be getting faster and faster flows within the stream channels, and we're going to get more erosion. So the result is that we wind up with too little water during dry periods because we've reduced infiltration and therefore the stream flow, and we get too much during the wet water events, and the result is this process. So there's a really great local role here. You can protect and restore riparian areas, the areas on both sides of the stream, and the channel itself. You can revegetate, you can stabilize the stream banks, and all of these things have value to the streams in the long run. So what do we do about this? And there are planning and design issues that we can deal with for these issues. One is to protect the availability of water supply. We can maintain recharge. For instance, development regulations that require that post-development recharge or infiltration be the same or even greater than pre-development recharge or infiltration. We can impose water quality controls. For those areas that are not in sewers, septic system density is important. The quality of the infiltration water, you don't want to be putting polluted water into the ground. And to reduce runoff volumes is also important as a way of maintaining stream structure and water quality. There are many areas, however, that have already developed. Over time, some of these are going to go into redevelopment, especially in urbanized areas. So the question is, how can we design the redevelopment so as to move toward a level of water infiltration, water quality, water supply maintenance that is required of new development, so that we're bringing things back up, we're restoring the ecosystems and the water supplies. One of the things that we should be careful about is that utilities, our water supply and wastewater utilities, in many places have been in the ground for many decades. They're getting older. They are getting less and less capable of managing our water supply and wastewater needs. We're getting more water main breaks and so on. And so we're going to have to spend quite a bit of money to bring these back up to full integrity. We shouldn't be assuming that our in-the-ground utilities are going to be able to handle everything we want to do. Additional water supplies, additional wastewater management, additional stormwater. So don't assume it. It's not necessarily going to be a problem, but don't assume that everything can be done. Controlling septic system density, as I mentioned, but of course that's only valid in areas where you have room for additional development. One of the issues that's important from a wastewater and water supply and stormwater utility perspective is what's called utility service area efficiency. So if you have a mile of pipeline and you only have 10 customers on that mile of pipeline, the cost per customer is much, much higher than if you have 1,000 customers on that pipeline mile. The more customers you have per pipeline mile, the easier it is to get the revenue necessary to maintain these systems over not just the next few years, but over hundreds of years, which is true sustainability. So all of these issues need to be played out within your communities and within your region. And I would emphasize that these are choices. They are balancing of economic impacts to water supply and wastewater and water quality impacts. They are amenity choices. So there's no hard line. There's no, bright line that says this is bad and this is good. It's more of a continuum, and each community needs to make a decision as to how it's going to move forward. So I've mentioned stormwater a couple of times. The thing about stormwater systems is that they're sort of the orphan utility. In most places, the water supply utility has an owner. It charges its customers. The wastewater utility, the sewer company utility, has its customers and they can be charged. Stormwater systems generally are not handled in the same fashion. Instead, they're considered, like the streets, a public work, and they don't tend to get maintained even as well as streets do. So the municipal separate storm sewer systems, or what are called MS4s in our regulatory language, they're in our developed areas. There are in Westchester County thousands upon thousands of stormwater outfalls, most of them unregulated, and in few places in Westchester County, but pretty much anywhere, are these managed. Why is that important? There are relatively few wastewater treatment plants in Westchester County or anywhere else. There are stormwater outfalls everywhere, and the result is that far more stream miles are damaged by stormwater than by sewage treatment plants and industrial effluent. And that's something that people tend not to know. So what happens in the receiving waters? Stream degradation, water quality issues. Within the stormwater systems, you get street flooding problems because the stormwater systems were not designed for these larger storms that we're getting. You get loss of groundwater recharge because the water is being intercepted and then moved out to the streams very quickly. And as I mentioned, deferred maintenance, or in many cases, no maintenance at all. Part of our problem here is that we have old thinking and old technology. So many of our stormwater systems are just a pipe directly to the stream, as you see on the lower right. Then we got a little bit more sophisticated, and we have these basins, detention basins, where the water is held back for a while. But small storms just move straight through them. You have these concrete low flow channels. These are actually fairly destructive to streams also. And then, so you have this issue with regard to the, it's almost like we were afraid of water. I guess we were afraid of water. We move the water directly from where it falls into a stormwater system and out to the stream as fast as possible. And that has been very destructive. So key issue here is, as we go through redevelopment process, we can improve the impacts of stormwater on our stream systems and our groundwater. And we can go back and retrofit some of these old systems so that they're more protective of the environment. We can also do something that was never really thought about in the decades before, and that is to use stormwater as a resource. Instead, we've been thinking of it as a wastewater. Get it out, get it away, take it from us, and put it somewhere else where there's no somewhere else. Our somewhere else is somebody else's there. So why not use stormwater as a resource, as a way of supporting beautiful plantings, as a way of supporting um, fountains and ponds and things of that nature. So we can look at stormwater in a very different way, and many places in the country are doing so. We can look at changing our design storms so that our stormwater systems are capable of handling these larger, more frequent storms. We can deal with recharge protection, water quality controls. We can reduce peak discharge velocities, and we can try to control discharge volumes. And we can use stormwater for amenity values. So all of these things are happening in many places, and they can happen here as well. Green stormwater infrastructure is the general heading that we use to describe this. The idea is to slow the movement of stormwater, to retain it, to use it, instead of just getting rid of it. It also means managing our stormwater systems as systems, so that instead of having each stormwater outfall as if it was a completely different thing than the next stormwater outfall down the line, we look at all of our stormwater systems, both the intake points, the pipelines, and the discharge points, as systems, and see how they affect the watersheds and what we should do about that. That can lead us to restoration of our streams and improvement of the stream amenities. And the idea behind redevelopment is that we achieve restoration. It isn't just a matter of not making it worse, the status quo, but restoring our stormwater management to something that is more environmentally benign. Despite anything we might do with stormwater, we will have flooding, because flooding is natural. Flooding is something that rivers have done for all of time. The problem is we've put development in those places. So how can we deal with this? There's several different ways we can deal with it. And the local role is basically to work in hazard mitigation plans and implementation. There are things that can be done at the local scale, at the lot scale. You can do flood proofing of commercial buildings. You can do stormwater redesign when it's a street flooding issue. You can develop flood warning systems. You can do improved flood risk mapping. All of these things will mitigate damages, and from that perspective are very positive. The problem is there are some pieces of development that simply shouldn't be there. If they're not there now, development controls are a great way of preventing them from being in there. And we should be addressing the floods of the future with these larger storms and not just the floods of the past. Improved stormwater management will achieve some level of control for flooding, but don't let anybody tell you that it will solve your flooding problems, because flooding is natural. So then you get to the question of what can we do for structures that get hit over and over and over again. And there are two answers. One is that you lift them higher so that the floods move under them, like this picture on the lower right. The other is that you move them out of harm's way. This is a buyout process where you actually take out the development. You can move the house if it's in good shape, or you simply tear down the house, but you pay people to relocate. You pay people for their property. So this raises some interesting questions for municipalities. For instance, does your municipality participate in the FEMA community rating system? FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They run the National Flood Insurance Program. If your community participates in the community rating system, you can get lower rates for the people who use the National Flood Insurance Program within your community. The problem is very few municipalities have done this. I took a look, and out of 1,543 New York State incorporated cities, towns, and villages, only 53 are participating in this program. That makes no sense to me. I don't know why it's true. It's true also in New Jersey and many other states. But there's a way of reducing costs to residents. Why not do it? Second question, what about your zoning ordinances? What about your site plan ordinances? Do they prohibit development in the floodway, the areas closest to the stream? Do they strictly limit floodplain development? Do they make sure that if somebody fills part of a floodplain, that the same amount of fill is taken out of another part of that same floodplain so that there's a balance? And is your municipality addressing the potential for larger floods that are coming from this climate change process that we're seeing? For those who are in the development process, how will the development avoid future hazards? Not just the minimum requirements to deal with today's floods, but in the future. How will redevelopment reduce flood hazards? Are there access roads to the development that are at risk? You know, it's a really dangerous situation if you can't get emergency vehicles into a developed area during a flood. So what are we doing about that? And does the development incorporate the floodplains as open space amenities? We can use floodplains for completely valid purposes. For instance, ball fields or recreational areas or something like that. When the flood comes, it gets flooded. Who cares? And then the floods go away and we reuse the land. Let me talk for a moment about water demands. So water demands in homes have actually been declining over the years. On a per capita basis, they've been going down. And they've been going down in large part because of federal requirements for the use of water efficient plumbing fixtures, and because of manufacturers for things like dishwashers and clothes washers and so on, coming up with more and more efficient devices like front-end loading high efficiency clothes washers. Tremendous reduction in water demands. So the total demands per capita have been going down. However, in many places, peak demands are going up. And that's because we're using more and more water for outdoor water uses, lawn irrigation being a primary one. And that's a reaction to these short droughts, to these higher temperatures during the daytime. And so we're getting higher peak demands, but lower overall demands. And so the idea here is to figure out ways of conserving water in a way that will work for everybody. More efficient water, lawn watering devices, for instance, that are, you're not going to have an issue where somebody is watering their lawn while it's still raining. We've all seen that. So water conservation can, in the outdoor uses especially, can be very valuable. There are planning and design issues involved in this process. One is by minimizing the amount of yard that you need to irrigate. You can have no and low irrigation areas through landscape. And there are ways of doing this where you just reduce the amount of area that you need to water. So drought tolerant does not mean that you need a desert. We're not Nevada. We're not Utah. We can have very beautiful but drought tolerant landscaping. We can design for indoor water conservation. One of the interesting issues, of course, is that denser development has less lawn area per home. And so we can use less water per person in denser development. And denser development does not mean Manhattan. Denser development can be a matter of 5 units per acre, something of that nature. We can also use stormwater as a non-potable water supply. And so taking rooftop runoff and putting it into a cistern and then using it for irrigation instead of having it go to runoff is a perfectly valid way of dealing with things. And then redevelopment can reduce water demands relative to the development that used to be in that spot. So the question is this your community vision of progress, where everything is paved and we have cars all over the place and we're not managing stormwater properly? Or can you find ways of bringing water into the communities and using water well so that we maximize the value of water instead of treating so much of our inherent water supply, the precipitation, as if it was a terrible thing that we needed to get rid of through incorrect stormwater practices. One of the resources that I point people to is this American Planning Association report from 2017 by colleagues of mine. It's called Planners and Water. It's a really good resource. In addition, Westchester County Planning has an environmental component to its website with some great information in there as well. So I would recommend to you both of these publications and sites. That's what I have for you. This is my information in terms of how to get in touch with me. Feel free to email me. I do respond to emails. And if anyone knows where I can find the Cistern Chapel, I would love to visit there. Thanks very much for your attention.